Okay, and we're live. Aloha kakahiaka kako, and welcome to our webinar this morning. My name is Napua Casson-Fisher, and I work for Papa'olelo Kahi, the Native Hawaiian Health Board. I oversee the Native Hawaiian Health Learning Institute at Papa'olelo Kahi, where we provide trainings and educational opportunities for community and Native Hawaiian health workforce. Just to start off, I'd like to provide some housekeeping announcements. We are live here on Zoom. We have a few people here on Zoom as our audience, and we are also connected to our Facebook. And so our Facebook friends can also watch this webinar live there. We are in webinar mode, so we're unable to see alo ahealo face-to-face our audience members, but once we get a handle on our chat, you will be able to put your questions and comments in the chat. For now, it's for some reason disabled, so kalamai for that. We also have the Q&A that I see many people have provided their mana'o there. For those who are on Facebook, please feel free to comment or ask your questions in the chat, and we will be checking that frequently and forwarding them to our presenter. Today's webinar is titled Navigating the Death Space. Today, for folks who didn't know, today is National Grief Awareness Day, August 30th. And we wanted to provide a webinar that aligns with the purpose of this day to raise awareness of the myriad of ways in which individuals cope with loss. National Grief Awareness Day offers resources to those going through personal losses and reminds us to support people we know who are grieving. It was founded by Angie Cartwright in 2014 with the hopes to encourage open communication on loss and bereavement and better inform the public on the facts of grief. Today, we welcome to our virtual stage Cortney Gusick, the founder of Pāhiki Caskets, which is a Mama Earth conscious casket company in Waimanalo on Oahu. She established Pāhiki Caskets after a deeply moving and educational experience accompanying her father as he died. She has since devoted the last 5 years to facilitating environmental stewardship in death care. Cortney is committed to solving critical sustainability issues in the end-of-life space, particularly in collaboration with community-centered organizations. She earned a bachelor's from American University and a master's from Brandeis University in Sustainable International Development. We will be talking about her mission at Pāhiki Caskets and also a funeral guide that Papa'olelo Kahi helped to translate in Tongan and Hawaiian, and she'll talk about the process in creating that and making it accessible to community. So please help me welcome Cortney. Aloha, mahalo for joining us all the way in Aotearoa at the moment.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your time this morning. I'm just a little recent post-COVID-y, so I'm a little congested sounding. So please excuse the clearing the throat constantly. But I really appreciate everyone's time today. Time in particular, as we know, is our only non-renewable resource in our whole life experience. And so I really appreciate you sharing with me and the group today. About 12 years ago, my family came to kind of a crossroads. My dad, we found out, had pancreatic cancer, and it was very late stage by the time that we were actually made aware. And it was the first time that we had ever faced kind of the precipice of the death space and navigating what that might look like and understanding what the options were. And as we came closer and closer to that space, we started realizing that the options that were presented to us in traditional funeral homes were maybe all is not fair, primarily non-biodegradable materials. And it was my dad's wish to be buried and to return to the earth. And so from very early on in the experience of planning his end of life, we started realizing that there was this very wide gulf between the way that we had lived and aspired to live our lives as a family, especially for my dad, who was, a very eco-conscious human being. And he and my mom were really striving to have a household that reflected that. So when we came to this place where we were kind of considering what that space might look like for him, it just didn't seem consistent or congruent with the family that, we would be trying to recycle and compost and upcycle and reuse all of these materials and resources. And then in the end, intern my dad back into the earth with things which were not biodegradable and were very inconsistent with Mama Earth's diet, essentially, because she does have a very specific diet, just like many of us do. And she has allergies too. And so when we started really considering what our options were, we had this really wonderful neighbor at the time, and we didn't really understand where the kind of impetus or information was coming from him, but he was very knowledgeable about the death space. And we later learned it was because he had had a very young child who had died. And so he and his family had a lot of very deep and heavy experience in the death space. So he had actually kind of in passing informed us, oh, you're kind of allowed to do kind of whatever you'd like. Of course, there are some limitations, but you have a pretty wide range of opportunities in the death space. You don't have to buy a casket from that funeral home. It doesn't have to be steel. You don't have to embalm dad. You don't have to have matching pallbearer gloves to inter him back into the earth. And so that conversation catalyzed this really deep dive that turned into, now fast forward years later, an incredible passion, and I would consider calling for me in my life. We had taken that information and started really searching and researching what alternatives might look like, what was legal where we were. And it turns out there was a vast, wide range of opportunities we had. We ended up ordering a very simple, beautiful pine casket for my dad. We actually had it sent to our home while he was still alive, so he could himself engage with it in his own way, even though he was very ill. And essentially to kind of help close the loop and have him participate in this incredibly intimate, deep experience that he was about to have in this journey that we were all on together. Excuse me. And we learned also in that experience things that we were wholly misinformed about before as a family. We thought embalming was a law, for example, which it turns out it's not. We thought that the only legal way to transport him to his resting place was through a hearse from a funeral home, also not accurate. We ended up getting a very simple, probably $40, I think at the time, permit from the Department of Health and transporting him ourselves to his resting place in a truck. Again, this was just our interpretation and version of what something more meaningful and eco-conscious looked like. This could look like 1,000 different things for different families, but for us, it felt really important that when we were actually essentially moving him for the very last time, that he was in our care as a family until the very moment that we placed him into the earth, that we cradled his body and wrapped his body and enveloped his body. So it was very important to us as a family. And after I had that experience, I just started thinking kind of about exponentially what the numbers were like. How many people die every year in the States? How many people are buried? How many people are cremated? Do you have to have a casket for cremation, or is it just for burial? And I just went down this extremely nerdy rabbit hole, which got me so interested and excited in really kind of posing and trying to answer questions of sustainability in the death space, because it wasn't something I had ever considered in my entire life. We have this whole entire, turns out, $22 billion a year industry in the US. That's annually. This industry that's completely hidden in plain sight. We're literally burying before our very own eyes, you know, millions of tons of toxins and chemicals and non-biodegradable materials very unwittingly. You know, I can't think of any family I've ever engaged with before who goes into the experience saying like, I want to put maximum amount of pollution in the earth and death. It just so happens that, you know, given limited information, limited knowledge, and limited viable alternatives, or seeming viable alternatives at the time, that families will often have to default to this very generic experience, which really does not reflect, for the majority of people, at least I've ever encountered, the cultural, environmental, or even economic values that the families share. And so sorry. There's a small, very adorable baby who, they need me. Okay, I'm so sorry about that. Thank you so much for sharing the deck. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled program. And so in posing and answering these questions to myself and just kind of diving into a lot of research, I started realizing that the death space truly has become a sustainability crisis, a very silent crisis, but a crisis all the same. And I started thinking about what could be a meaningful contribution among many to helping to mitigate the environmental impact and the weight that Mama Earth has to carry and hold. And so I started thinking about what are the consequences of this, you know, current landscape of our death care practices. And, you know, the first being, we have all these very eco-unconscious practices that are, you know, contributing into the land, the air, and the water, millions of tons of pollutants and chemicals every year. I started really researching and learning the weight of caskets, the consequence of steel, what actually happens to steel when it's in the earth over time, how many gallons of gasoline it takes to cremate a body, what's the CO2, and just really, really getting sometimes into the weeds with the details. And I also started thinking about what is the consequence to our communities and our cultural values when we have these very generic, very siloed experiences in traditional funeral homes. And I did quite a bit of research across multiple states and found that whatever cultural practices and values were of importance either to people indigenous to the area or just diverse different groups of people were not reflected in the funeral home experience, and were certainly not reflected in the funeral home catalog. For anyone who's navigated the death space before, when you walk into a funeral home, there are catalogs with all product offerings, etc. You were hard pressed to find any that reflected anything other than the very traditional experience. And the other thing that we started noticing when in the research was that because the funeral home experience is such a heavily mediated experience, meaning very driven by the funeral directors and the agenda of the funeral home, it was really preventing families and communities, moreover, from having any real engagement. You know, it's like the moment that a family typically walks into a funeral home, the messaging is, and again, this is just typically, this isn't every time, but the messaging is often that just hand over, you know, the reins to us and we'll take care of everything, which can sound like a very enticing offer in the moment, especially when you're grieving, when you're in this very heavy space, and when you're not familiar with your rights or protections otherwise. And so, can we get to the next slide, please? And so, as Pāhiki Eco-Caskets, our other mission, our first being, of course, to provide biodegradable wooden caskets for burial, cremation, and viewing. Our secondary mission, and just as important, is to ensure that every family in Hawaii understands their right to culturally, environmentally, and economically meaningful end-of-life experiences. I said the solution. There are many solutions, but I did accidentally put the in here. But just know that there are multiple. The solution is to have a diverse death care practices represented across the board in funeral homes and in our communities. And what that would look like is having eco-conscious options, not even just eco-conscious options within the funeral home themselves, but also understanding that we can ask for and request and even require more eco-conscious practices within the death space. And this is of particular importance because I'm willing to bet that most of us here have a whole series of different eco-conscious behaviors as families and as communities that we're striving to uphold or fulfill. Extending those to the death space really gives us an opportunity to maintain continuity in the way we live and the way we die, so that our death care practices and our eco legacy reflects, what our aspirations and behaviors and practices were in life. And having cultural consistency is incredibly important. It's really difficult and heartbreaking sometimes to see that families, for a variety of reasons, whether it was they weren't informed of their rights or for economic reasons, have to default to very generic, very environmentally impactful choices in the death space, whereas in their life, I'm certain that it wasn't culturally consistent with their highest values and aspirations. And shifting from a very heavily mediated experience to a community-led experience, having the design and implementation of many different facets and aspects of the end-of-life space and the funeral or service or celebration of life be very community-led and community-driven. Which brings us to the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule. So it turns out, rewind back to the beginning, that neighbor who had informed us that we have all of these rights and protections and capacity to do a wide range of practices with my dad as he was dying, he was actually referring to the FTC's funeral rule. Now, this is this absolutely incredible document in the early 80s at the Federal Trade Commission, who protects consumers, essentially. It's kind of a strange term to call us consumers in the death space, but that's essentially what we are. That they had come up with this list of rights and protections that every single person is entitled to. And it was to help, it really was to help do three things, in our estimation at least. That was to reframe, rename, and regain. So at a glance, the funeral rule, it's a bulleted list of kind of very basic, very kind of industry termed rights and protections that we all share. But what they're actually trying to do is, the Federal Trade Commission is not legitimizing per se our cultural rights and our rights to have more environmentally friendly funerals. They actually created the document to reframe the whole experience we have with funeral homes. So instead of having this mediated experience where we walk in and we're these very passive kind of half to non-participants in the space, they've allowed us this document to share a language and to share expectations with the funeral home. So it would be easy to read it and think, oh, thanks, FTC. Thanks for telling me that I have cultural rights. Which, to be honest, at a glance, that was initially what I had thought as well. But the more I was diving into it, the more I was realizing, oh, the Federal Trade Commission is essentially saying, we're aware that you have rights environmentally, economically, and culturally. You're certainly aware as a human being. The disconnect comes when you step over the threshold in a funeral home. So we're going to create this document. We're going to reframe the experience with you from stepping into a space where a person is directing you to a person helping facilitate what is culturally, environmentally, and economically meaningful and important to your family. So it's this really beautiful, incredible document that is very, we rarely find families that are aware of this. And it really is a very fundamental game-changing experience to understand your rights before you walk into the funeral home. What it also does is rename. So we really try to focus on helping families understand that funeral homes are facilitators. They're not directors. And because it's already kind of baked into the name, it can be confusing when you walk in to think that that person has the privilege and the right and the responsibility even to direct your family through the process. Nothing could be further from the truth. What it actually is funeral homes are wonderful, wonderful resources. You know, they have everything from emotional to kind of logistical and practical resources that we may not have in our own homes, or we may not be able to do or exercise for a variety of reasons. So they're fantastic, fantastic resources. So just helping shift the kind of experience from, again, being a funeral director to a funeral facilitator is also something that the funeral rule does extremely well. And then regain. It's also designed to help families regain their sense of control is not the right word. Privilege is probably a better word. Their sense of privilege of being able to carry out experiences that are more meaningful to them in the end of life space. And also regaining a sense of, again, the funeral rule isn't telling us we have sovereignty in the death space. We already do. It's helping us regain that understanding and grounding in ourselves and in our communities that we have that, and having the confidence to actually approach the funeral home experience very differently with that understanding. So the funeral rule, so a bit earlier this year, we had put out a call because the funeral rule currently only exists in English and Spanish online. So we saw a huge gap in opportunity and helping any human beings who will navigate the death space, which is 100% of human beings, turns out, the opportunity to access and understand the funeral rule and their rights. So anyone who was a non-English or non-Spanish speaker, as far as we could find, was essentially, it was a barrier to entry. And so we had put out a call earlier this year with about 8 other Pacific and Asian languages. And Papa Ulukahi was absolutely phenomenal, reached out and said, okay, we've got Tongan and Hawaiian covered, and potentially a third language in the future. And people from all kinds of stretches and corners of the earth wrote in and said, oh, I'm a primary Japanese speaker, I'm a etc., and had volunteered. So the other languages are still in progress. But again, it's so vital that we have these translated versions of the funeral rule, as they, excuse me, as it really is it's a very important document for people to understand. And because it was a little difficult even for us, even with a lot of kind of, again, very almost nerdy level of understanding of the death space, if you haven't ever stepped into a funeral home before, there is some languaging in there that you wouldn't necessarily understand out of context. And so we really started thinking about, is this user-friendly for families? So it's one thing for a family to know that they can access something, but how actually accessible is this to families? It isn't a matter of it just having a static place online somewhere. Is this accessible? If I walked into your home and you told me, oh, you know what? You are entitled to have a general price list breakdown at the funeral home before you leave, I would have absolutely no idea what you meant. And so, excuse me. So at Pāhiki, we decided to take the Federal Trade Commission's funeral rule and to take it rule by rule. So we actually created a family community kind of guide, community-led handbook. And it goes through each of the rules verbatim, so you can understand the kind of industry speak of exactly what the rule and protection is providing. But then we also gave some suggestions of what it may look like. So these are not hard and fast. They're certainly not comprehensive, but we have for each of the rules for each of the rites, a set of what this might look like. So for example, one of them is you can purchase a casket. This one's particularly relevant to us. You can purchase a casket outside of a funeral home if you so choose. A lot of people don't know Costco sells caskets, for example. Pāhiki sells caskets. Walmart.com sells caskets. Your son, your neighbor, your family friend might also make caskets. Casket also might mean woven. It might mean, it's so many different materials. And so we just gave a kind of short 3 to 5 bulleted list for each of the rites so that families can just really start thinking really outside of the funeral home experience box and thinking about what resources might already exist, who in the community is either skilled or willing or interested maybe in assuming, this portion of the experience, and really filling that. This first right here that we're scrolling through, this one is of incredible importance. This one is the ability to choose and select any of the services that you would like. So oftentimes when we walk into funeral homes, because there are pretty generic catalogs, it can get us thinking in this very kind of limited, narrow terms of, okay, so these are my options. If I want a casket, I need to pick one of these 10 caskets. Flowers and wreaths, okay, here are the vendors right here. But actually, as it turns out, part of our right and protection in the death space is that we can buy anything outside of the funeral home that we would like. Any of the flowers we can source from local farms, friends, front yards, caskets, shrouds, urns, etc. We can also, for partial cremation, utilize the crematorium service just for that portion of it and still retain the bones. And on that particular note, just a really exciting forthcoming tidbit on that is that Aloha Mortuary is in 2023 going to be providing Aquamation, which is water cremation, this incredibly phenomenal alternative to flame cremation. So it will help eliminate the 25 gallons of gasoline it takes to cremate every single body. And we'll instead replace it with a very gentle water experience. And one of the really incredible things about that process is that it provides the ability to families to retain completely whole, non-fragmented, clean white bones, which is of particular significance to a lot of families. And so in making this guide, our hope is that families will read through this. You can see the very, again, practical, direct sort of funeral industry speak of what it is. And then really to get families thinking of what this might mean for, what does this mean for our family? What could it mean for a family? What could it mean for our community? What sort of resources are already existing to kind of pull together and create much, much more meaningful, personalized, intimate experiences that really reflects community values, cultural values, and environmental values. Something that is leveraging both the skills and resources of established funeral homes, which again are wonderful facilitators, with practices, ways, protocol, resources, et cetera, that already exist, and kind of wedding those two things together in a way that starts to create more of a balance and shifts the kind of inherent power imbalance that exists right now in the funeral space. I want to just pause there if this is an appropriate time to see if there are any questions. I realize I've been talking a blue streak now.
Let's see. I don't see any questions in the chat at the moment, but if anybody wants to share your mana'o or has any pressing questions, please write them in the chat or in the Q&A. We're on Facebook. Is it streaming live? It's streaming on Papaololokahi's Facebook page. I think I didn't share any cross-posting relationships, so currently it's just on Papaololokahi's Facebook. We have 2 people from Waimanalo joining us. Someone from Pahoa on Hawaii Island. Mahalo nui. No questions, no questions. Do you want me to continue to share screen or?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yelani is from Hilo. Aloha, Hilo. And currently no questions on Facebook.
Okay. Do you have any questions? Kathy,
I'm thinking of questions. Auntie Kathy. Auntie Kathy, you have any questions?
I don't know if you know the process for the water cremation. Would you have that? Can you possibly provide more information on the process for that?
Definitely. Yeah, I can send over some information on that. And as far as I understand, Aloha Mortuary will be the very first in the state to offer that. The water cremation bill just passed and became legalized about a month ago. Yeah, which is, it's wonderful and exciting. And it also really helps. I mean, back to the cultural consistency. Of course, we didn't have Aquamation machines in the past in Hawaii, but because it uses different temperatures of water and lye to essentially reduce the body back to its bone skeleton form, it has a much, much, much lighter touch on Mama Earth than flame cremation does. So even by that kind of degree, it is getting us closer to cultural consistency, you know, because if you look at not just Hawaii, but you look at any indigenous community across the world for all of time before, let's say, the last 100 years, every single death care practice affirmed the earth and regenerated the earth. We didn't have any practices in the past that ever detracted from or polluted or poisoned the earth and death. This is a very recent, new industrialized way to handle the death space. So this actually, it's, you know, leveraging kind of modern technology essentially, while actually taking us closer to a way that we used to perform and behave together in the community, which was to touch the earth so gently when we died.
A few more questions on Aquamation. Somebody asked, how long does it take? And can Aquamation fully replace cremation? What legislation must be passed for this to happen in Hawaii? I'll look at the legislation that just passed and put it in the chat.
Yeah, it just became legalized. I'm not sure if the question is there legislation for it to completely override and replace flame cremation, or is the legislation to legalize aquamation in the first place? I wasn't completely sure about what the legislation part was referring to.
It might have been replacing
it.
Flame cremation with aquamation.
As far as I understand, I can't think of anything or point to anything that is suggesting that that's on the books anywhere. That would be amazing, though. It really is. Flame cremation is very impactful. I mentioned a bit earlier, it's an average of 25 gallons of gasoline per body, and that's 3 hours of consistent controlled burn, which is also 540 pounds of CO2 per body per cremation. So it's a non-insignificant amount, and that is not by any means I'm just speaking very practically. That's not a judgment on anyone's decisions. That's just practically speaking what the impact is for that particular choice. So having the water cremation is a good next kind of alternative, again, because we are growing in our understanding by degrees of, you know, really returning to our sovereignty and our power and our rights and understanding them within the death space, both community wise and, you know, legally speaking. So this is a great step towards that. Oh, and how long does Aquamation take? As far as I understand, it is a few hours.
Let's see. I don't think you mentioned this earlier, but in a previous conversation we've had, because we've had you present to our Hawaiian Civic Club before, you talked about burials on like aloha on Ohana Aina, and some miseducation or misunderstandings about what's allowable. Would you be able to share more about that?
Sure. So being able to be buried on private property in Hawaii is also contingent on zoning, unsurprisingly, like anything else that's established or built or used. And so mostly for outside of Oahu, let's say, there are a lot of areas that are zoned for private burial. So it is completely legal in those zoned areas to be buried, whether that's full body, whether that's ashes, whether that's bones, on your own property or on family property. And as the process goes, you go to the state planning office with the tax map key, and they actually determine your proximity to water tables, aquifers, etc. And then are able to then give you a permit for private burial. It's understandably, because of the population density, it's a lot trickier and more limited on Oahu to do that. But on other neighbor islands, it's a lot more possible and feasible. And also, in terms of a burial that's more eco-conscious and more green, essentially, that's probably the greenest you could get, would be family property, doing things in a very light touch way with the family. But on neighbor islands as well, there's a handful of cemeteries that have green spaces dedicated to them. So there's spaces where you're buried with no embalming fluid, which is very toxic, a casket or a shroud, which is biodegradable. You can have anything that is non-biodegradable there. And it's usually a kind of shorter time between the time the person dies and the time that they're buried, because you don't use embalming fluid. And so those are possible, mostly outside of Oahu. Oahu's still got a lot of very traditional rules for cemeteries. So that's one distinction actually I should make, is that the funeral rule is overseeing the funeral home experience and the offerings of the funeral home, which is separate to a cemetery. Unfortunately for cemeteries, they still have some pretty gnarly toxic requirements. Oftentimes you have to have a burial vault around the outside of the casket, and that's constructed usually of concrete or fiberglass, or just plastic sometimes. So it's still difficult in this kind of current environment we're in to get around those aspects, but still plenty of other ways to do things in a more eco-conscious way.
Paula Ann Burgess doesn't really have a question, but she left a comment in the Q&A, and she said that she would love to learn more about informing families of their rights. She works with families in an ER who have just been informed about a death, and she feels that many are making decisions based on who they know in the funeral industry and who they have experience with, not so much about what the deceased would want or what is culturally important to them. She's thinking of creating a handout to share with them, something that they can use to help them engage better with a funeral home. Do you have any mana'o or advice to share?
Awesome. First of all, that's wonderful. In terms of something that's a little more succinct than a 12-page funeral rule, which is overwhelming even when you're not in the midst of grief, it is a lot to kind of digest. We could either collaborate on making something that's more succinct, or give information and just pass it over, and you could make something that you felt was appropriate or more succinct for that. So we're definitely open to either option. We've definitely got enough kind of information and data to do either.
She says, yes, let's collaborate. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good.
Let's
Yeah, we
see.
can definitely do that. It's so of course delicate, and the timing can be very tricky. I mean, I know families don't want to be sitting at home on a Friday night reading over the funeral rule together as a family, but all jokes aside, kind of one of our higher hopes is that we can either digitally or physically get the funeral rule family guide into every home, as many homes as possible even, and have families in a time of kind of ease, essentially. So meaning when they're not actively navigating the death space, read through and just start to have conversations. Nothing that's too weighty or that needs to be executed on immediately, but just really starting to read through and think about what these opportunities might look like for the family and what it might look like for them to draw different resources from the community or from their family members, when they do enter the death space. So yeah, just really getting a sense for what's possible before it becomes critical, because it's a very, very difficult time for families when they're in the midst of grief to be thinking about logistics. Actually, probably for most people seems crass to kind of make a logistical list and things when your parent just died or when your family member just died. So really getting a handle on it before. And the thing that I completely neglected to mention before was that one of the beautiful things about the FTC's funeral rule is because it sets forth so clearly what our rights are. Again, we really believe that they wrote that mostly for the funeral homes to kind of put them on notice, essentially, that we're all aware of our rights collectively, and we're all aware that this is a facilitation process that they're, at best meant to be carrying out with us. That knowing that you also have this legal right and protection also allows families to be able to walk into a funeral home in a way that is not contentious or argumentative. It's not walking in thinking that, you need to go to bat for or fight for or convince or explain, why you want to do things a little differently or in a non-traditional way. It's allowing, again, a framework to operate within that tells everyone involved, we all understand that we have, a wide range of rights here and capacity to do things that might look very different. And so it kind of takes away the burden essentially from the family of feeling like, okay, we're grieving and now we need to walk into this experience and try to convince, this funeral director that we want to do things this way. It kind of sets the stage already in such a way that the jumping off point is much smoother for everyone, because it shouldn't be the burden of any individual or a family to walk in and say, I don't want to do things in this way. I don't want to put embalming fluid into the ground. I don't want to, it's not, consistent with our family values, and then have to argue that point. So it really helps to kind of share language around it and share expectations around it.
If you folks have any more comments, questions, please put them in the chat. Let's see. You're in Aotearoa now at the moment. Is there anything, not so much traditional or cultural with Maori customs, but is there anything that happens in Aotearoa that you hope could transfer over to Hawaii as far as laws or, those kind of things?
Yeah, I would say, and this is not something that's actually limited by law in Hawaii, but maybe not practiced as much. So one of the rights that we have, even in Hawaii, is to have let's say a family member dies, I think kind of on TV and in the movies, we think, oh, you call, this number, or you call a coroner, or you call, and then they come and they take the body away. And that's kind of the last time most families will engage with their loved one. But here, and again, also legal in Hawaii, is the capacity to have the person in the home with you, even for a couple of days, and to use cold packs, dry ice, etc., and to really have, not such an abrupt process of the person dying, which is so heavy and jarring enough for most families, to then the person just, within a matter of hours disappears, and to have it almost more similar to the birth process, where, it's like the contractions and the intensity, and then it doesn't happen all at once. And so having the person at home with you, or in whatever sort of home kind of environment or facility is comfortable and possible, and having it be a little more gradual, even if that's 5 hours or 10 hours, it doesn't need to be 3 days. And just kind of having that, that kind of more gentle release, like the, opening the door and the bird kind of, realizing the cage is open now, and sort of just like taking flight in a little more gradual way. And it's practiced a lot more commonly here. And I hope, and I think and believe that in the kind of near-term future in Hawaii, we'll do similar things, especially the more that people start to understand that it's legal, it's sanitary. I mean, even practically speaking, it's possible, and even the transport of the body from home to a funeral home, also legal. So I would say just having that level of touch and engagement kind of from the start, essentially, of when a person dies, I hope to see more of. And of course, it's happening in pockets all over the state. Of course, I'm just one person, so I don't have visibility. So that's not to say that families don't do that by any means, but to have that idea more socialized and comfortable in Hawaii would be amazing.
I do remember that was something that I learned from watching the Netflix show, or not Netflix show, but it's on Netflix, The Casketeers. I really like that show.
Yes, me too.
Have you had much experience or interactions with Pāhiki Caskets with any end of life doulas or death midwives? Have you experienced working with them? Have you seen a rise in families learning more about them and bringing them into their space?
Definitely. I can't say I've had any primary interaction, meaning I haven't actually been there physically in a home with a family. Definitely seeing a rise in one, death doulas, and two, families really starting to understand. And what's really beautiful about that offering is that it's a really short distance between not knowing what that is and then understanding and appreciating. Because when you liken it to a birth doula and you think about the, continuum of our existence, it's a very comfortable, familiar role, essentially, in society already. The concept of a birth doula, people don't look at a birth doula and think, that's crazy. Why would you want somebody to help you usher in your child into the world? And in the same vein, I think that, especially for the past 2 years, with death being, much more prevalent part of people's experiences and consciousness with COVID, people are also starting to understand and really, again, appreciate that there are death doulas for the end of life experience. I'm definitely seeing a lot more people kind of responding to that calling, not maybe themselves not even understanding before COVID that a death doula was a thing, or that it was possible, and a lot more trainings and certification programs. And yeah, I think it's such a beautiful offering, because it's also, again, where, we shift and change always by degrees. It's another degree towards, drawing back to essentially ourselves and our kind of really like core spiritual and cultural ways of having this sense of sovereignty is what it is over your body and over the process, and having somebody who helps facilitate that.
Is it okay if I put your email in the chat?
Yes,
Okay, great.
please do.
For maybe Paula, who wants to reach out to talk more about that handout for her patients' families. And this is my email at Papaololokahi in case you have any Papaololokahi questions. Paula says, wow, I realize that there is a lot of misinformation out there, including what medical staff tells families about what they can and cannot do. ER staff should be required to learn about what ohana rights are regarding the deceased.
Yes, yes, triple yes.
Triple yes. Elizabeth says, thank you so much. So grateful and informative. If folks don't have any more questions or comments, we can end a little early. Courtney, do you have any final thoughts before we go?
No, I just thank you all again so much for your time. And I hope that the funeral rule will make it into your home and hopefully into your dinner time conversation one of these evenings.
Thank you. Thank you so much for presenting and doing the great work that you do. And of course, for making time to present for Papaololokahi. Mahalo to everyone for joining us in the middle of your day. There's lots of mahalos in the chat for you, Courtney. Please, audience members, if you have any more questions, email us. And for any further updates, future trainings and webinars, we always update our Facebook, Instagram, and our website. And we hope to see you in future Zoom webinars. Mahalo nui. Have a great day. Aloha.
Thank you.